All right, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Lizzie. I'm one of the postdocs at the Center for Middle East Studies, and I'm very pleased today to introduce our speaker, Professor Frank Griffel, who's Professor of Islamic Studies here at Yale. And his work has been on Islamic philosophy and theology, as well as Muslim intellectual history. And his earlier work was on apostasy in Islam, and particularly al-Ghazali. And then he's moved more to 12th century or so history of philosophy and Islam. And his talk today will focus on his most recent book, which came out this year, called The Formation of the Post-Classical Period in Islam. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Lizzie, for this kind introduction. And as you say, this is a presentation of a book that actually came out in June. I have it here. It has become much bigger than I initially intended. It has close to 600 pages, The Formation of Post-Classical Philosophy in Islam. And I've prepared a PowerPoint, which I want to go through, which might take something like half an hour or so. And after that, we are going to have a Q&A. My understanding is that you put questions in the chat, and I'm trying to answer them as good as I can. Okay. So if you don't mind, I'm actually going into the PowerPoint. I hope you can all see the PowerPoint, the first page. So we basically start in this case with a good dose, in this case of classical Orientalism. Here you have a picture of somebody who was very instrumental and very influential in the formation of our understanding of philosophy in Islam. He wrote the very first monograph on the subject in French, focusing on the subject of Averroes, who was the Islamic philosopher who had most impact in the European Middle Ages on Latin philosophy. The title of the book was Averroes et l'Avérisme in French. He presents a whole picture of Islamic philosophy that we wouldn't talk about today, quite frankly, about a book, in this case, that was published more than 160 years ago. It was first published in 1852. If his views weren't prevalent until way into the 20th century, it's only in the last quarter of the 20th century that they became questioned. And the view that Renan actually put forward, many of the people in this case here in this Zoom room who are of my generation might actually be familiar with, because they learned this when they were undergraduates or grad students. And I have a quote here. According to Ernest Renan, Islamic philosophy had its heyday in the period in what I identify as the classical period, means in this case in the 9th, the 10th, and also the 11th century. And then later on, it basically disappeared, according to Ernest Renan. And the quote that I have here in this case is, Arab philosophy had lost in him, that is Averroes, his last representative, and the triumph of the Quran over free thinking was assured for at least 600 years. The tradition in which Renan writes, and in which many of those who followed him among Western scholars who wrote on philosophy in Islam, also perceived philosophy was, of course, the tradition of European Enlightenment, which saw Catholicism as its major enemy. Free thinking here stands for the tradition of Enlightenment thinking, and the Quran, the triumph of the Quran, is more or less, an equivalent of what in Western tradition we would call the Church. So these were perceptions that were shaped in the West, and that initially had a strong influence on the Western idea of what philosophy was in the Islamic world. And there's also in this sentence itself, it's a very colonialist element, because if you do the math, first of all, Averroes actually died in the year 1198, and you add 600 years to 1198, then you end up in the year 1798, which is well known to everybody who knows Islamic history, namely in this case, this is the French occupation of Egypt, the beginning of the colonial period. So in between these 6 centuries, in between the classical period of Islam and the beginning of colonialism, there was, according to Renan, no philosophy in the Islamic world. There was, however, the triumphs of the Quran, there was religious thinking, and it's only through the process of colonialism that philosophy is reintroduced, of course, by European actors here. What Renan and others, already Renan, but then others as well, identified as the factor that ended the philosophical discourse in Islam was this book. Here we have title page of the English translation of Michael Marmora, Tahafut al-Falasifa by Imam al-Ghazali. This was published in the year 1095, so at the end of the 11th century, translated here as The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And it's a book where al-Ghazali criticizes with many of the arguments that were put forward by the philosophical tradition, particularly by one very important thinker who lived roughly 80 years before him, that is, who's known in Arabic as Ibn Sina, and who became known in the West because his works were also translated in the Middle Ages as Avicenna. I refer to him as Avicenna. He died in 1028, and so this book was perceived as the one in this case who basically, made the coup de grace or performed the coup de grace against philosophy in Islam. From that moment on, it was basically over. And I should once again say in this case, we deal with these old ideas, not because they were prominent in the 19th century. Lots of stuff people thought about the 19th century, and the people like Ernest Renan was also, he had a very racist idea about, what philosophy was and who pursued it. But that was not something in this case that really maintained. What was important was this idea in this case that over 6 centuries, philosophy did not exist in the Islamic world. It was really an idea in this case that I, for instance, when I was a grad student in the 1980s and the 1990s, was taught. In fact, it was only in the 1990s that people started to come up with different ideas. In fact, by now, we should actually say there is nobody who works in the field of intellectual history, in Islamic intellectual history, who would put forward this view. You will find it more on the popular side, in more popular books, and of course a lot on the internet. But the field of Islamic studies has moved away. We now know that philosophy continued, but we were still struggling in trying to formulate what actually happened with philosophy basically after al-Ghazali. And here I would like to credit one of my former colleagues here at Yale, Dimitri Gutas, who 20 years ago, at the beginning of the 20th century, put out, suggested what might be called in this case a master narrative of philosophy after Avicenna. This was an article that he put forward in this case in a journal, and he argued in this case that after the 12th century, after al-Ghazali, there was still a golden age of philosophy. In fact, the golden age in this case of the reception of Avicenna. He identified Avicenna as the key figure of the Islamic discourse, and I here have a chart that he included in this article. You can see Avicenna here as a central position. In the central position, all the traditions before Avicenna are picked up by him. He formulates a very important philosophical synthesis, a system. And then after Avicenna, you have basically mainstream Avicennism, anti-Avicennism, and the third group as well. This was suggested, as one might say, in this case, a narrative of how philosophy continued after al-Ghazali and after the 12th century. But it's also, we should say in this case, people who started working with this, and I myself amongst them in this case, found out very quickly in this case that this is that this doesn't really hit the nail. Particularly because this idea that there were people who supported Avicenna, and then there were anti-Avicennists, that actually didn't really work out. And I should just highlight a name here that I will focus on later. That is Fakhreddin Arazi, for instance, is here. in brackets, but nevertheless is counted in this case among mainstream Avicennism. And then somebody else in this case who has a huge influence on Fakhreddin Arazi, Abul Barakat al-Baghdadi, is counted here as anti-Avicenist. And yet in reality, the picture is much more complex. Meaning in this case, what is really happening after Avicenna couldn't be clarified in this article, and we'll say in this case that this was an interesting attempt to explain what was going on, but we could by now say in this case that it doesn't really fit what happened. So colleagues, and we are still working on this, and what I'm trying to put forward today in this case is an alternative, and say in this case, I have a certain idea of what really happened, and of course this I put into this book and try to present to you as good as I can. Should also say in this case that my colleague Dimitri Gutas himself moved away from this to a certain degree, and in a later article, this was published in 2018 at a conference, first presented at a conference in 2016, he coined the word paraphilosophy for what happened basically after Avicenna. The idea is in this case that Avicenna was a true philosopher who has this huge impact, and yet that after Avicenna, what we see for people doing there in this case was appropriating Avicenna's philosophy to something in this case that is no longer pure philosophy. They were, in fact, in this article, he says it's more in this case some theologizing philosophy, and hence it is no longer philosophy, because philosophy is defined by Dimitri Gutas in this case as the pure rational inquiry into the world, and for instance also into good, that is not into God, that is not guided by revelation, for instance. Okay, now so far about the context of my work. So what people in my field are doing, we're trying to basically come up with an explanation of what happened with philosophy after Al-Ghazali, and that's what I attempted to do in my book. And here I focused on the eastern part of the Islamic world. So Averroes, who was active in Al-Andalus, Ibn Tufayl, others, lots of people have worked on that. I actually don't touch that at all, but I worked on these areas here. This is Iran, this is Iraq, this is what is called today Central Asia. The key province that I identified here, and this is Khorasan, this is here. Today covering northeast Iran, parts of Afghanistan, parts of Turkmenistan. And I see that something is going on there that we largely have overlooked, and that manifests itself in numerous books that were known, but not very well studied. And here I have a list of books here. These are authors of what I identify as the post-classical period. I should say the post-classical period, I basically mean anybody after Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali is, for me, in this case, the last classical author, the last philosopher of the classical period. And after that, we have post-classical philosophers, and they do philosophy in a significantly different way. They write significantly different books, and those I try to explain in my book. So what I found in this case was, when you take a look at the books that these people wrote, then the word hikmah becomes very important. Hikmah, which initially means wisdom, it's referred to in the Quran, but and this is something I want to explain here, it really replaces the word falsafa, which might have led to Renan's mistaken insight, which was also picked up by much more better readers of the tradition, such as, for instance, Ignaz Goldziher, who really read a lot of Arabic texts, but what they didn't figure out, or what they didn't pick up in this case, is this change of Arabic terminology, moving away from falsafa to hikmah, and therefore also identifying falsafa with philosophy and hikmah less so. So here, authors like, you have Abul Barakat, the important book is Al-Kitab al-Mu'tabar fil Hikmah. Then you have Fakhreddin Arazi, he has Al-Mulakhas fil Hikmah wal Mantiq. Yet at the same time, he also writes book on Kalam or in Usul al-Din. And these are books that are actually can be characterized as theological books. Saifuddin al-Amiri has this Nur al-Bahir fil Hikmah Zawahir, Daqa'iq al-Haqa'iq fil Hikmah. And then he has Ghayat al-Maram fi ilm al-kalam and al-afkar al-afkar fi usul al-din here being more or less synonymous to, and so again in Athiratin al-Abhari and Najmatin al-Qadi, sometimes they just have books on hikmah like Abu al-Barakat al-Bakhtari and al-Katibi. But there are authors, and these are the ones in this case that interest me most, who actually have books on hikmah and books on kalam. So this was what triggered my interest and my inquiry. And I should also say in this case, and here I have a document or the analysis of a document, we can really see the move away from falsafa towards hikmah as a new phrase, as a new word that refers to philosophical activity. This is the list of entries, tarjamas, in a work of the history of philosophy. This is Ibn Funduq al-Bayhaqi, who wrote a very important work where he writes about philosophers in Islam. It's called Tatimmat Siwan al-Hikmah, the continuation of the Siwan al-Hikmah. And here I focus in this case on relevant people. So here scholars of the 6th century, I very early focused then on the 12th century of the Christian calendar, basically after Al-Ghazali. And we can see in this case that, how are these people referred to? The name comes and this is Al-Faylasuf. And you can see in this case that there is initially in the century, in this case, there is a whole line in this case of people who are called al-Faylasuf. But then at one point, and here is, Ibn Sahlan as-Sawi is the last one, you can see in this case that they're referred to in different ways. Then, al-Hakim, al-Hakim, al-Hakim. And when we actually, this is the first part, the second part of the list in this case, you can actually see all of the word Faylasuf hardly appears at all. It appears in this case for Abu al-Barakat al-Baghdadi. And then I think a second time here in this case, but all the others are basically referred to as al-Hakim or min al-Hukama. That's also something in this case. It's very interesting. So we see that in the 12th century, and Ibn Funduq himself writes within the 12th century, more or less in the middle of the 12th century, we see that he documents this swift in this case from the word Faylasuf, from even the word falsafa as a word for philosophy, for Faylasuf as for philosopher, towards a different word in this case. So there are certain conclusions that I draw in the first part of my book. Ibn Funduq al-Bayhaqi identifies a number of scholars who we know in this case were faithful to Avicenna as Faylasuf, and Ibn Sahlan as-Sawi was the last one. These were people who were basically not impacted by the criticism of Al-Ghazali. They hardly refer to it in their writings. They do not refer to it, and they do tradition in the they do philosophy in the tradition of Avicenna. They write epitomes of his book, or they write in their own books. They write different versions of his teachings. However, we can say in this case that philosophers who engage in philosophy and who were trained at a madrasa, meaning at a religious institution, are actually never referred to as philosopher. That's the reason why Abu al-Barakat is referred to as one, because he has a different life. He was a Jew who converted to Islam and therefore was also he was not at the madrasa and can therefore be a Faylasuf. And in fact, generally, and this is a more general conclusion, in the wake of this book, Tahafut al-Falasifa, the label falsafa and falasifa became more and more perceived pejoratively, and people move away from it. That's what we, for instance, seen in Abu Barakat himself in his book Al-Mu'tabar fil Hikmah. He hardly ever uses the word falsafa. He hardly uses the word Faylasuf, and certainly not when he refers to his own activity. He calls about hikmah and he calls about min al-hukama. That in the 12th century, the word hikmah, which of course has Quranic connotations, replaces the word falsafa for various reasons that I actually go into my book. And of course, you might actually say Al-Ghazali's attempt to persecute philosophy, also something in this case that I work on in my book and ask in this case, how successful was that attempt really? And come to conclude in this case that it was not very successful. But Al-Ghazali's attempt to persecute has certainly something to do in this case that people move away from falsafa towards hikmah. And falsafa is continued to be used, however, now in the meaning of Avicennism. It's clearly identified with the teachings of Avicenna, with the kind of pristine teachings of Avicenna, so that at the end, in the 12th century, we can document the move as such. In this case, Falsafa is Avicennism, and Hikmah is any kind of philosophical activity that manifests itself in its book. Okay, that's one of the first conclusions that I have. And now I want to move on, in this case, to Fakhreddin Arazi. I should actually say that in my book, in the almost 600 pages, I try to do justice to almost all philosophers who are active in the 12th century, up to Fakhreddin Arazi. Fakhreddin Arazi is basically the last philosopher I was dealing with. So it tries to be a history of philosophy also in the 12th century. It looks into various aspects of the culture of philosophy, of patronage, of material conditions of working on philosophy, and of course, and this is the main part in this case, of these books of Hikmah, how they and what they actually do, which is, and I should say in this case, these books of Hikmah are the post-classical philosophy in Islam that appears in the title of the book. So Fakhreddin Arazi, who you might not know very well, and I should go back in this case, of course we don't have pictures here, but this is his picture of his grave, which one of my students actually visited in Herat in Afghanistan today. Again, we cannot go there, at least I cannot. He is an important, very, very important figure. I mean, if you know anything about the history of philosophy in Islam, so far you have heard the names of maybe Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Al-Ghazali. This is definitely a name you should add to those four. He is extremely influential in this post-classical tradition, and which has been overlooked for so many decades in our field. He, in many of his books, writes about certain of his works as kutub hikmiyah, philosophical books. And when you actually look what he means by that in this case, then there are two important philosophical compendia and one commentary. So a book in this case that is called the Eastern Investigations. It's huge. It has 1,200 pages in the latest print. An early work, which he wrote while he was probably still in his 20s. And this is something that is mentioned before, the Compendium of Philosophy and Logic, which he wrote when he was in his mid-30s, and which became a very important textbook of madrasa education, which was hugely influential. And thirdly, in this case, there is also a commentary on one of Avicenna's books, Pointers and Reminders, which he wrote after 1184, either in his late 30s or in his early 40s. These are books in this case that he himself says, these are books, philosophical books. Now, what does he do in these books? Here in this case, I have, I should say that, one of these books, the Mulakhas fil Hikmah wal Mantiq, was for a very long time even not edited. People have not paid much attention to it. It was just this year, actually even after my book came out, that the book was edited. It's now in an edited version. And in my book, in this case, I still refer to manuscripts when I quote this book. This is the famous Leiden manuscript, which we think in this case was even used by another important scholar, Christian scholar, Bar Hebreos, because there are marginalia in Syriac in this manuscript. So what do these philosophical books do in Fakhreddin Arazi? And here are a number of conclusions that I argue for in the book in this case. First of all, they offer systematic reports of Avicenna. And this is nothing new. Al-Ghazali actually started doing this in his Maqasid al-Falasifa. And I argue that this genre of books of Hikmah actually has their starting point in Maqasid al-Falasifa. They really they develop from the Maqasid al-Falasifa, which tries to do interesting things with Avicenna's philosophy, which we cannot go into here, which I also enumerate in my study. First of all, so they just report other people's teachings. But then they also rearrange the subjects of philosophy. That's a very important task. So Fakhreddin Arazi develops a whole new curriculum of philosophical studies. And what we mean by philosophical studies, this is the philosophical tradition that started with the Greeks, with the pre-Socratics, and here, particularly with Aristotle. Aristotle's works are of course fully translated into Arabic, and there was a certain tradition how to study them. Fakhreddin Arazi puts an end to that and has its own sequence of studies that he develops here. And lastly, thirdly, this is the important thing in this case, They criticize Avicenna in this case and make improvements to his philosophy, which you might say in this case is something you might expect. But the important thing in this case is that they don't, these books on Hikibai in this case, they don't touch on, the most fundamental element of Avicennan philosophy. They more or less accept Avicennism on its own term, and you might say Aristotelian philosophy on its own term. And most importantly also, they do not introduce evidence from revelation, evidence from what we call Islam, as arguments. This is not happening. The question then is, in this case, how does Fakhreddin criticize Avicenna? In this case, does he, for instance, do it as an Asharite theologian, which he wrote books in theology? And the answer to that is clearly no. He puts on the hat as a follower of Avicenna and says in this case, okay, so let's say this is all true. There are still certain things in this case that really don't work. And I have two enumerated here. These are the two ones that are most important in my book. This is the most philosophical part of this presentation. And I should say in this case, so the first point is in what we call ontology. And this goes a little bit into the teachings of Avicenna and the tradition of Avicennism. So Fakhreddin Arazi argues forcefully that if there is essence and distinction between essence and existence, as Fakhreddin Arazi accepts, yes, this is one of the key teachings of Avicenna, then all beings are subject to the distinction of essence and existence, including God. You might actually say, yeah, what does that actually mean? It's very complicated, but it's a very central point that he makes here, because Avicenna has argued in this case that God doesn't have an essence. God is only existence, and that has certain philosophical implications. And Fakhreddin Arazi basically argues, this cannot be the case. From rational arguments, we must conclude that God also has a distinction, is subject to the distinctions of essence and existence, and that there is essence in God. You might actually say a little bit in this case, what does this mean in layman's terms? And in layman's terms, basically means how, should we think of God in this case as having a core, some kind of thing in this case that is identifying, that creates the world? Or is it just in this case that he is this creation principle that comes out of Avicenna? And you might actually say also in this case that Fakhreddin Arazi's criticism here is still, you might say, on the weak. He does not reject the fact, for instance, that God acts out of necessity. He does not reject the fact that this world is not created in time, but exists from past eternity. He actually maintains that in his books, in his philosophical books, and other things as well that are key to Avicennan philosophy. This is the first point. The second point is in epistemology. Again, in this case, I'm unable to explain all the implications here, but Avicenna has argued that there are real forms out in the world, that the world is shaped by real forms, and that we perceive these real forms when we gain true knowledge. True knowledge means, in this case, scientific knowledge. And here, Fakhreddin Arazi also objects. He said in this case, there is no evidence that there are really forms out there. The only thing that we know in this case that we ourselves are the ones in this case who create forms in our perception. Whether they're really out there or not, in this case, is an open question. This actually is a debate that was also very important in Latin medieval philosophy. It's the so-called conflict over the realities. And we can basically say in this case that Avicenna was on the side of the so-called realists. They said in this case, forms are real, they exist in the outside world. And Fakhreddin Arazi was more on the nominalist side. He was definitely not a nominalist itself, but he was, the critique that he puts forward is nominalist. But he still maintains that there are forms, but says in this case, these forms are created by our human kind of process of apparatus of perception. Okay, so what I want to point out in this case, that the God in the books of, in books of Ibn Sina in this case, is still the same, very much the same God in this case as Fakhreddin Arazi. It's a creation principle. It has no free will. The only thing is in this case, it has an identifiable core that he doesn't have with in Avicenna, where he says Avicenna, it's pure existence. Which brings me already in this case to part of my conclusions that I want to. What I put forward here in this case is that what changes in philosophy after Al-Ghazali is that we have writers who write two sets of different books. Let me clarify this a little bit in this case. Books of theology and books of philosophy. And these books are distinct in many ways. They have their own rules, you might say. These are all, we might say, two different discourses, or I actually say these are two different genres. And these genres have different rules. In my book, I go so far in this. These are two different types of rationality that are pursued there. And in books of Hikmah, Fakhruddin Arazi, he really continues Avicenna's philosophical project and offers criticism that is system immanent. Meaning he does not say in this case, this is really all not true. This, as Al-Ghazali does in his Tahafut al-Falasifa, where he says these arguments are not very persuasive. He actually says, well, what if it really works? What if this Avicennan system is really true in this case? Where can we improve on it? And that's what he does in his philosophical books. And then, distinct from these philosophical books, he also talks about, kutub kalamiyya, books in kalam. And there he actually puts forward, teachings in this case of Asharite theology, Asharite Sunni theology. And these books are also very much influenced by the techniques of philosophy and ways to argue philosophy, but they also include evidence from revelation, and, for instance, argue for the creation of world and time. So if we have these two sets of books, we can really say, in his philosophical books, he argues for an eternal world that is not created in time. And in his books of Kalam, he's very clear and puts forward arguments where he says, in this case, that this world is created in time. And this world is governed by a God, in this case, for instance, who can change, who is omnipotent and omniscient, and also teaches, for instance, occasionalism here, and he teaches a different kind of cosmology, namely heliomorphism, in his books of Hikmah. Lastly, my book is about the formation of post-classical philosophy in Islam, and I might already preempt the question that you have. So how long does this kind of tradition maintain? And I do not make any predictions about that. I really stay within the 12th century. But the way I see in this case is that this is something that continues for a while. This is later authors really maintain this distinction. They also talk about philosophical books. They also talk about Kalam books. As I said at the beginning, there are other authors in the 13th and the 14th century that also make this distinction. And currently, other research projects are going on that find this distinction. Also, for instance, working in the Ottoman period. So it's something in this case that prevails for a while. I'm not making any predictions about how long this takes because I didn't read those books. This I leave in this case for other people to see where this is leading. Lastly, then is there a new master narrative in this case of philosophy after Al-Ghazali? And this is what I put forward here as a, I would say, suggestion or hypothesis based on the evidence that I presented. So Muslim scholars of the post-classical period, they wrote books in the genre of Hikmah and others in the genre of so first of all, in this case, we talk about Hikmah and others in the genre of Kalam and other religious discourses, like, for instance, this is tafsir, not tasir, there's a typo in there, fiqh, other books in this case, where they actually follow different rules of engagement. In their books of Hikmah, revelation is not accepted, for instance, as evidence, but in the other genres, of course, it is. The genre of Hikmah is committed really to philosophical inquiry. And as I said, in this case, revealed knowledge is not evidence, not allowed evidence in this argument, although we should say that the whole philosophical system is also geared towards explaining certain elements of revealed religion, like, for instance, prophecy, the existence of prophecy. There are scientific explanations of prophecy. There are scientific explanations of the karamat, of the awliya, of insight, of revelation itself, and inspiration as well. These things, in this case, are discussed in the books of philosophy. And philosophical, meaning scientific explanations, are given for these phenomena, which are accepted as real. And that's also true in this case. I should say there's another avenue here in this case. Magic is also an interesting subject here, which is also considered as being real, as being a phenomenon of the world. And there are philosophical explanations in this case for how magic works, that are currently also being investigated in this case by by colleagues in my field. Okay, in fact, and this is the last point that I make. There are lots of things that I, of course, cannot come to explain here, what I do in my book. But there's this interesting thing really about, so how do these books of Hikmah position themselves towards Islam? They themselves don't talk much about Islam. They are engaged in inquiries about God and about revelation, but it's hardly that the word Islam actually ever comes up there. But in other books, Fakhruddin Ar-Razi writes about the relationship, and he says, Hikmah is not really something that is part of Islam. What does this mean? I think this is a reflex in this case of when Al-Ghazali actually tried to push philosophy out of Islam and persecute it. And we should say in this case that Fakhruddin Ar-Razi has no interest whatsoever to persecute any philosophers, because he's himself one. But what he clarifies is, in this case, this is a discourse that, because it is unaffected by revelation, it stands out of Islam. Or even, we should even say in this case, the kind of opposite is not so much Islam, but it's what he calls here in this case, there are the hukama on the one side. There's this group that he calls a milliyun on the other side, which is a word in this case that is derived from the Arabic word millah, simply means in this case religion or religious community. And it's, he refers to, and this, he says in this case, and this can include other theologians, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, who, for instance, all of these theologians, most of them, we should say, argued for the temporal creation of the world. And the hukama argue, in this case, for an eternal world. And lastly, I just want to point out in this case that just if we look at the title of these books, there is a whole library of books, of texts, of epistles that are written in this genre of hikmah. And that we still have to discover. Most of them are available only in manuscripts, which actually shows that the 600-year period where earlier scholars have thought in this case there is no philosophy in Islam. In fact, in this case there is a rich tradition of philosophy that and this is a sentence that we're saying in this case for 30 or 40 years now, that we still have to discover. We still haven't done that. Thank you very much for your attention, and I want to close my PowerPoint now. Let me just say how I do this. How I take this out. Yes, right. And Lizzie, don't get me wrong. In this case, my understanding is I'm going to look at the
at that Q&A. Can you pull that up?
Yes. So please, in this case, I invite you to put forward questions.
And then there's one question that someone put in the chat, if you can see that as well.
Yes, I did already. This is Heba. Yes, whom I know very well, our postdoc at the Institute of Sacred Music. Yes, let me write. I will try to limit curiosity here to give a chance to others. First, is there a relationship between the shift from Falsafa to Hikmah to the interdisciplinary work of these post-classical philosophers? I notice, for example, some are described as Hakim and Tabib. Yes, which I am assuming is a reference to medicine. That is right. Also, could you elaborate more on any traces of Averroes in Ar-Razi's books on Hikmah? The last question is the easier one. There is nothing. Fakhruddin Ar-Razi was not read during the 12th century in the Islamic, sorry, Averroes. Averroes, Ibn Rushd, the great philosopher of Al-Andalus, who is a towering figure in philosophy in Islam's West, was not read in the 12th century in the East at all. I haven't found any trace of him there. It's, however, at the end of the 13th and beginning of the 14th century that we actually see some of his books there, and also you should say in this case, maybe this is a good occasion to also explain this. So what Fakhreddin Arazi develops here, and of course he was not the only one, but what he expresses, this kind of parallel ways of looking at knowledge, the knowledge tradition of hikmah and the knowledge tradition of kalam. That is a particular way of how philosophy relates to revealed religion. And we should say that Averroes, who was almost a direct contemporary to Fakhreddin Arazi, does something. He is actually 20 years older or something like that. Also develops a certain understanding of the relationship of philosophy to revealed religion. And Averroes has a different idea about that. His idea is very much a continuation of what we find in Al-Farabi, where he says in this case, philosophy is the real truth, is the superior truth. And religion is just a way in this case to convey these kinds of truth, these true insights, scientific insights, to a more general populace, in this case, who's unable to pursue this kind of study. This is not something Fakhreddin Arazi subscribes to at all. He really develops a different model. And we also see in this case that in certain periods, for instance, in Egypt, we see these two different models of how philosophy and religion relate to one another. In the post-classical period, we see them clashing. And I'm actually preparing currently a paper on that, where I show in this case that at the beginning of the 14th century in Egypt, we have certain ideas in this case that are closely connected to more Averroes model, and others that abide in this case to the suggestion that this tradition, the Eastern tradition, actually makes about that. That's the earliest. There was a long answer on the easy question. So the second one is in this case, let me go, maybe I go back to the slide and simply show you for that. In this case, I gotta go back to the screen. Yep. Yes, you are absolutely right. Your observation is definitely correct. When we actually look at this list, then we see that there are, al-Falasuf, al-Hakim, and then there are also at-Tabib. So that is due to the fact that what Ibn Funduq al-Bayhaqi does in this book is he gives a history not only of philosophers, but also of physicians. That is in the tradition, you might even say in the Greek tradition, of how philosophy was understood. Philosophy was often seen in this case as the kind of medicine of the soul, and hence, therefore. Now, what you, of course, and I know Heba in this case, what you probably think about in this case is, yes, when you have Egyptian Amia and you say the word Hakim, you think of a physician. Right, so the Hakim is how that actually plays into it. That's something that in classical Arabic we never really had. The Hakim here, as far as I understand in this case, is really a philosopher who is trained. That's in a madrasa. That is the kind of context. Meaning in this case, he can no longer be a philosopher. So that is the distinction that Ibn Funduq al-Bayhaqi actually brings in. Whether that actually plays, whether it also starts to have this, acquire in this case, this different meaning in this case of physician, might be true or not in this case. That's something I can say little about. Okay, somebody raised their hand, but I don't know what to do about that. Okay, what else do we got in questions? Is there any further research about Ottoman philosophy in departments of Islamic studies? Yes, some examples about them. The best example in this case I can give are many colleagues of mine in this case, particularly in Istanbul, in Turkey, who works, for instance, in this case, Cüneyt Kaya, works on Ottoman traditions. Maher Alpar works on Ottoman traditions. But there are also, this is also done here in the West. And I should point out in this case that I, for instance, currently have a grad student who works on Tash Köprüzade, who in his understanding of the different sciences really has a similar model here in this case. There are certain philosophical sciences and there are certain religious sciences, and they work more or less parallel to one another. So there is a lot of being done in this case also on the Ottoman side. Right, and I'm not sure in this case whether I have any more questions.
So look in the, do you see the little Q&A?
Yes, I thought, yes. Okay, oh, all right. Yes, I'm okay, yeah, of course. Mohammed Hussein, yes, thank you. Fine. Joseph Cumming ask, do you see Razi as the main person responsible for the terminology change from Falsafa and Hikmah after Al-Ghazali? No, he's not. He's actually only at the receiving end of this. This is happening. So the document that I shared with you is written in this case around 1150. This is the time in this case when Fakhruddin Razi actually only is born. So this is happening in the middle of the 12th century. And we see it everywhere. We see it also, Maimonides, for instance, also a figure who really, this is a change in the usage of Arabic. And we might actually say, in the past we would have said in this case, this becomes a feature of Middle Arabic. Not sure in this case it would go so far. But there is in the 12th century this difference in understanding of what philosophy means in Hikmah. And I would say it's happening in the middle of the 12th century. And as we all know, language doesn't change by a single actor. There is a certain common understanding about things that change. Joseph also has a question in this, how do you recommend translating the word Hikmah? Okay, so this is an interesting question. How do we translate that? And here comes up with a different question. What is really philosophy? I also discussed this in the conclusions of my book. And I say in this case, of course, Falsafa is philosophy. Of course, Hikmah is philosophy. So meaning in this case that, we have a certain word field in English, philosophy, that translates into more than one word in Arabic, Falsafa and Hikmah. And I would even add, and here I make a point in this case that I have definitely not the chance to defend here sufficiently, that Kalam is also something in this case that we should take into account when we think of what we do, what we mean as philosophical activity. Kalam is also, it follows certain rules of rationalism, and it connects itself also after Fakhruddin Razi, after Abul Barakat al-Baghdadi, very closely in this case to the philosophical discourse. And let me see, let me go, Ismail Kuron, let me know, do you think that we can call this interesting phenomenon in medieval Islamic thought an epistemological crisis? Alistair McIntyre defined epistemological crisis as a lack of an arbiter between conflicting knowledge claims. Drawing on McIntyre, I argue in my work, yes, that there is an epistemological crisis in medieval Islamic thought, and the crisis was caused by the fact that you couldn't develop empiricism which would solve the crisis. Ismail Kuron, interesting suggestion. In my book, I actually go down a different alley. I actually follow my colleague Thomas Bauer, who talks about ambiguity, not so much about crisis. Because I think philosophically, what's at the bottom of this is the human inability to, for instance, really know God rationally. And of course, in the Western tradition, we connect Immanuel Kant, most importantly, to this insight, that there are just certain bounds of reason. And if we actually read this tradition very closely, we can find that as well, that we're actually saying this, we cannot decide, humans, whether God acts out of necessity or whether he actually has a free will. Acts out of necessity is the position of Hikmah, whether having a free will is the position of Kalam. So there is a certain ambiguity. Would I describe this as a crisis? I'm not sure, because it doesn't lead to some, crisis sounds very unproductive. In fact, here, this ambiguity is perceived very productively. Thinkers like Fakhreddin Arazi pursue both alleys. And so that what Thomas Bauer has coined is the phrase in this case of the taming of ambiguity. Meaning in this case, when things were really, when there was kind of, when ambiguity was overwhelming Islamic scholars, then they had a tendency in this case to establish a certain number, a limited number of solutions that were then developed. And I think precisely this is going on. So I'm not sure I would actually join and talk about crisis here. And let me read Angela Giordani, who has also just finished a dissertation. My question, when someone like Dawani, writing in the 15th century, talks about Ara al-Falasifa in juxtaposition to those of the Mutakallimun or Sufi, where do Al-Ghazali and the Hukama figure in here? Rests relatedly, when Ibn Khaldun complains about the falsafa, get mixed up with, yes, okay. So last question about Ibn Khaldun, totally complicated, can't go in there, but I'm giving a presentation at Mesa at the end of November, early December, which unfortunately has been moved online, but therefore is more accessible than it will be if we were, in this case, in Montreal, where I actually look precisely at these passages in Ibn Khaldun, which are very confusing. But if you actually look at them through the lens of this distinction, I think, and that's what I suggest, they make actually much more sense. So there's something that Ibn Khaldun doesn't like about this, for sure. And I'm trying in that talk, in this case, to establish what is it precisely that Ibn Khaldun doesn't like. It's not the fact in this case that there is post-classical philosophy. However, that's Ibn Khaldun. Dawani, very interesting, and his book, and here Dawani in this case. So by the time of Dawani, who is 300 years, roughly 300 years after this, things have evolved a little bit. And we also see this in his older contemporary, for instance, Al-Jurjani. Al-Jurjani has an interesting passage where he says, in this case, there are 4 kinds of traditions. There are 4. So whereas in Fakhreddin Arazi, there are 2, Hikmah and Kalam. Sharif al-Jurjani and Dawani then later as well say there are 4 traditions, and these are Hikmah. Then there is a Sufi side to Hikmah. This is Ishraqi philosophy. Then there is Kalam. And as a last tradition, in this case, traditional Sufism. So there are these 4 different traditions. And as an educated scholar of his time, of the late 15th century, like Sharif Jurjani is, you would actually pursue all 4 traditions. Fakhreddin Arazi pursued 2, Hikmah and Kalam. And at that point in time, to really count as a full-blown Islamic intellectual, you would need to be educated in all 4 traditions, meaning in Hikmah, in Ishraq, in Kalam, and in Tasawwuf. And Tasawwuf, I think in this case, largely stands here in this case for Ibn Arabi and the tradition of that. So this is, you see in this case how this also gets its own wings and develops. Next question is by Mehmet Gülech Yus. While your study adds the genre of hikmah to what we call philosophy in the Islamic world, in addition to falsafa, you seem to leave kalam outside philosophy. Does kalam reliance or partial revelation included from? I just say in this case, the last pages here, just read it. I do not exclude kalam. I develop a criterion of what I think is philosophy in the Islamic world. That I hope will be adapted by my peers in the field, and if we adapt that criterion, then kalam is part of the post-classical kalam, I should say, not the kalam of the early Mu'tazila, not the kalam of the early Asharites, but kalam in this case after the 12th century that engages very closely with Avicenna, that engages with Aristotle, that actually uses Aristotelian logic. That is actually part of what I regard as the tradition of philosophy in Islam. And I really regard it in this case as a tradition, as a discursive tradition. Kevin van Bladel, my dear colleague from the NELC department, My question is whether one might conclude in the end that scholars like Renan were right in a quite superficial and indirect way. I'm getting interested here. That is, if falsafa became a pejorative term, as you put it, then wasn't that the end of falsafa in a narrow sense, as the practice of tradition come to be refined and not to be remain under the name of falsafa? Similarly, with respect to Professor Guta's paraphilosophy, which implies that falsafa did not continue unaltered. Something to uphold is a merely, yes, interesting suggestion. Now, first of all, about Renan, in this case, if only he had used the word falsafa. But in French, in this case, he talks about philosophie, right? So if he had said, and this is even true for people like Goldziher, who were probably Goldziher is a better example here because he was really well-read in this case. He might have understood that, you know, just at a certain point, people no longer use falsafa as a self-ascription. But then he goes on and say, in this case, people don't use, in this case, philosopher as a self-description. So, and that's, of course, where, you know, the kind of methodological error actually lies. And I agree with you, probably coming from a different angle in this case, that Dimitri Guta's paraphilosophy is very similar to what Ernest Renan actually put forward. But to both, I would actually answer that what Renan here, more interesting, of course, what Dimitri Gutas doesn't take into account is that the discourse of Hikmah is really free from references to revelation, and it's not theologizing philosophy. I think that's more or less in this case, if you know, if there is a continued debate going on, which I hope in this case now, you know, the ball is back in Dimitri's camp. In this case, you know, he has to take a look at this suggestion and see in this case how this is theologizing, because that's one of my major points in the book. In this case, you know, there is of course, as we all know, in the work of Avicenna, philosophical explanation of religious phenomena. But you would not say in this case that this is theologizing the way Dimitri Gutas uses the word in his paraphilosophy article. Adnan Merja, ahlan wa sahlan. Given the fact that Al-Ghazali was a political thinker, is there any relation to this legal verdict, to his legal verdict against the Avicennism, due to the social or even political stagnation of the newly presented method in terms of the masses? I mean, is this a political red line put forward by him and not necessary? In Al-Ghazali's case, and Adnan, you know that very well, in this case, I have argued that it is a political line, yes. Al-Ghazali was afraid that Sharia is not upheld, and that's why he was afraid of such suggestions as that God doesn't know the individuals, or that there is no bodily resurrection in the afterlife. He feared in this case that if ordinary people hear about this, they will not obey Sharia anymore. I don't see anything of that kind here. First of all, as I pointed out, Fakhreddin Arazi is free, totally free, from the kind of persecuting spirit that we do find in numerous works of Al-Ghazali, in numerous works of Al-Ghazali, particularly the last page of Tahafut al-Falasifa. That is not in Fakhreddin Arazi, nor any other of the people who work on Hikmah after him. The only way how they relate to this is by saying, in this case, okay, if you ask me whether what I'm doing here in my books of Hikmah is kind of is Islamic, then they say, no, it's not. It's very interesting. And I think in this case, we still need a couple of books to find out in this case of what's really going on here and how this relates even to such ideas as, you know, the famous question, what is Islam? Recently discussed in this case very eloquently by my late colleague, Shahab Ahmed. You know, I don't even venture into the kind of possibilities that are. Yusuf Gürsey, yes, Bernard Lewis, whom I don't always agree with, but in this particular case argues in a short paper against the perception of most Muslims, a renaissance in the post-Mongol period in learning as well as governments, and argues for some beneficial effects of the Mongols. Do you have any comments? And yes, well, of course, the interesting thing is that, and I look at the way, I still have a little bit of time. The interesting thing is that I ended 1210 which is kind of a couple of years before the Mongols appear at the horizon. And the Mongols appear at the horizon in the year 1216. And then, of course, begins, what we call the Mongol invasions, which culminate in 1258 in the sack of Baghdad and the killing of the Abbasid Caliph. Simple answer in this case, there is, and I argue for that as well, there is a beneficial effect, if you can talk about that in this case, about an event that caused so many destruction of life, destruction of property, but most important, destruction of life. This idea of hikmah and the teachings of Fakhruddin Arazi, they are developed in Herat and in Khwarizm, basically in Central Asia. And once the Mongols actually come, all his students, all Fakhruddin's students, most of them, not all of them, some of them are killed, but the great majority of his students, and they were very numerous and very important students, they pack their bags and they go to Syria. And they go to Egypt, and they go to Anatolia, they go to Konya, to Damascus, and to Cairo. And so within a generation, these ideas spread and proliferate widely, and the Mongols certainly have play a role in that. Generally speaking, the Mongols have no interest in destroying this at all. They have, generally speaking, no beef in this. In fact, due to things in this case that are quite interesting, one, I would almost say, follower of this tradition, namely Nasiruddin Tusi, who at the same time also positions himself as an adversary to Fakhruddin Arazi, gains very central positions amongst the Mongols and promotes this. The school of what we now call Maragha Avicennism proliferates under the Ilkhanids, and this is something in this case that really becomes widespread, and it really is something that during the Mongol period gains proliferation amongst the Mongols and amongst the Mamluks on both sides. And here's another question. Let me see. In this case, I already had Joseph, so I'm going to go to Ahmed Göksu. Thanks for this. How the studies related to natural philosophy was affected in the shift from philosophy to hikmah. Haven't done any work on that. Somebody should work on that. I haven't done anything, so I better not say anything. And Yunus Henschel, is there evidence that the different results in different genres of rationality was applied also before Al-Ghazali, before Arazi? So this is an answer in this case. So what I do in my book, I really more or less start with Al-Ghazali and look into how this is a step-by-step process. And a very important author is Abul Barakat al-Baghdadi. And a very important author is Sharafuddin al-Mas'udi. And a very important author is Ibn Ghailan al-Balkhi. So there is a certain development there. You actually see element and element being added to this until you actually have the full-blown evidence in Fakhruddin Arazi. So this is, but you should actually say, so Sharafuddin al-Mas'udi is definitely somebody in this case where this is somewhat already there, but it's not, he doesn't reflect on this. He doesn't write in this case. I have books that are philosophical. I have books that are Kalamiyya. Fakhruddin Arazi at least adds that kind of reflection, although we should say, and this is what I bemoan on various passages in my book, Fakhruddin Arazi did not write Fasl al-Maqal. Fasl al-Maqal is Avera's manifesto of the relationship between philosophy and religion. And unfortunately, Fakhruddin Arazi did write nothing of this. I think this has to do in this case with the fact that he was engaged in madrasa education, and madrasa education itself provided some kind of institutional context which clarified a lot of questions that we actually have towards the relationship of philosophy and religion. But unfortunately, I also know of no other text of the Eastern tradition of post-classical philosophy that really spells out the relationship as the way in this case, which is why it probably remained undetected by so many. Let me just do one more question, and then I have to also disengage here because I'm actually teaching a class soon. Hi, I'm Bilge from Turkey. I wonder, did you mention Nasiruddin Tusi in your book? And the simple answer is no, only in the margins, not really. I mention him, but he's not object of my study. And you mentioned Al-Abhari, yes, Qazwini, yes, who lived at the same century and probably had connections to Tusi. We do think that they were students of him. but not 2c. Is there a reason for that? Well, there's a simple reason in this case is that I wrote 600 pages and stop at 1210. That's it. And if I talk about anything other in this case, I would actually say, you know, don't take anything. That there is some kind of, you know, I have hunches what happened in the 13th and the 14th century. And hopefully in this case, you know, when as Fakhreddin says in this case, you know, if my ajal is pushed far enough into the future, I might be able to look at that myself. But currently, I have not done that. And another question by Hussein, Muhammad Hussein, it is your understanding that hikmah is different from philosophy? No, it's not different from philosophy. No, hikmah is part of philosophy, and it is philosophy in this case. And let me just see, in this case, there's so many questions here. And I take this one, Kamal Ahmed. I had the same question about Ibn Rushd. Were these writers of hikmah in the 12th century not aware of Ibn Rushd at all, or did they consciously choose not to engage with him? I thought it was the latter. Did any of the writers of hikmah share Ibn Rushd's critique of Ibn Sina as having misunderstood Aristotle? If the works of hikmah take Avicenna at their starting point and are not interested in tracing Ibn Sina's idea back to Aristotle? Yeah, okay, so I think I got the question. This is an interesting question. And it is already, I mean, I'm not the first one to point out in this case that innovation, philosophical innovation for these people, meaning for the Eastern philosophical discourse in the 12th, after Avicenna, what is usually also called post-Avicennism. And here I quote my colleague, here I quote Tony Street. Innovation does not come from tracing back to Avicenna, from going back to the text of Avicenna. It actually comes from the confrontation between Avicennism and Ash'arism. That's what the source of philosophical innovation is. So it really is, in this case, it's the development of Avicennism in a certain direction. And that this direction is more or less defined, in this case, by arguments that come out of Asharite Kalam. That was different in Al-Andalus. Ibn Rushd is somebody in this case who goes back to Aristotle. However, you might actually say that also created an obstacle for his reception in the East. Going back behind Avicenna was regarded as almost philosophical reactionism. Avicenna was accepted as, you know, the milestone of philosophical achievement. And if somebody would come along, and so, for instance, we have figures in the East as well. Abd al-Latif al-Baghdadi is a good example. And if somebody in the East actually said, you know, Avicenna went too far away from Aristotle, then this was just not being picked up. Abd al-Latif al-Baghdadi, in this case, is not a successful philosopher who builds a school or is even quoted later. So you have these figures, but it's not very successful. And Ibn Rushd does this in the West and is successful with it, but we should also say in this case that Ibn Rushd has always been associated his philosophy with Almohadism, and Almohadism at one point in this case basically got a bad street rap, so that Ibn Rushd was also affected by that. I think, you know, the story of reception of Ibn Rushd in the Islamic East still needs to be written, and there is not, Ibn Taymiyyah knew him very well, for instance. So Mamluk scholars knew him very well. And I think, you know, that's also where I also have a paper now, Mamluk reception of Ibn Rushd. But generally speaking, here, these people, no, they don't. And that's also where I actually, maybe I have the very, very last. I take the very last question that just came in. Can we say that Giorgiani started a new philosophical tradition after Arazi? Possibly. As I said, anything you ask me, anything in this case that goes after 1210, I say, and this could be true, could not be true. We have to work on that. We have to basically sit down and read these texts, argue for our views, and that's where I see the future, inshallah. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor. I know you have to get to class.
Thank you. Thanks for being here, and thanks for these very, very interesting questions. Even if I was unable to answer all of them, I apologize for that. Thank you.
Thank you.